Hello, I'm Christopher Ferrara. I'm a civil attorney and author of several books on church, social, and political affairs, including The Great Facade, The Secret Still Hidden, and Liberty, The God That Failed, just recently published. I've been given the privilege of using this forum for a new addition to the programming of Fatima TV. In this show, entitled Fatima Perspectives, I'll be giving my commentary for your consideration on political, social, and religious matters, obviously from a Catholic perspective, and in particular from the perspective of Fatima, a warning to the Church and the world about the consequences of the course that Western man has been following for the past couple of centuries, which is why Our Lady of Fatima came to give her warnings and prophecies, and a course correction at the beginning of the 20th century. One of the problems Our Lady foresaw, which many Catholics believe, and which we are morally certain is the case at this point, is the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council. Pope Paul VI himself spoke of the auto-demolition of the Church after Vatican II. He himself admitted that the opening to the world, as he called it, became a veritable invasion of the Church by worldly thinking. He himself said that the smoke of Satan has entered into the Church through some fissure or other. That fissure was the opening to the world at Vatican II, when the Church supposedly embraced modern society in modern ways and looked for a way to enter into a rapport with what it called contemporary man. And the result, as Pope Paul admitted, was not good for the Church and was in fact disastrous. And now, this year, we're celebrating, or supposed to celebrate, the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council. And the aging conciliar diehards in the Vatican apparatus, who are now desperate to shore up the Council's crumbling legacy, have dared to revive and to advance at breakneck speed the long-dead cause for the beatification of Paul VI, the same pope who admitted that he had presided over a disaster. John Paul II initiated the cause for beatification at the diocesan level in 1993. But it didn't go anywhere from there for reasons that should be obvious, including the Pope's own admissions. One of the less obvious reasons was then Monsignor Montini's dismissal from the Vatican Secretary of State before he became Pope by Pius XII because he had conducted compromising secret correspondence with Soviet officials in direct defiance of a papal order to have no contact with the Russian government. And now we're looking at another rush job at the Saint Factory. That's what the secular press is mockingly referring to the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints, which in recent years has, under the pontificate of John Paul II, beatified and canonized more people than all of John Paul II's predecessors combined. And now we're told that there has been a position paper on the so-called heroic virtues of the Pope, Paul VI, who presided over the worst collapse of faith and discipline in church history, approving or tolerating all of the reckless innovations that brought it about, and then doing nothing to close that fissure he mentioned through which he admitted the smoke of Satan had entered the Church. It was he who said that the opening to the world at Vatican II became a veritable invasion of the Church by worldly thinking. But he also said, on that same occasion, of himself, "We have perhaps been too weak and imprudent." But apparently papal weakness and imprudence leading to an invasion of the Church by worldly thinking now qualifies as heroic virtue, according to the current members of the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints, which, as I just said, became a saint factory during John Paul II's pontificate. But we know what's going on here. This surprise beatification would rather conveniently complete a fast-track trifecta of all three conciliar popes, thus canonizing the council, as Robert Moynihan has put it, at the very moment its troubled legacy is falling apart. The congregation has obviously navigated around such speed bumps as real objections to the posited heroic virtues of Paul VI. John Paul II, of course, abolished the traditional devil's advocate. And also, the lack of any real proof of miracles attributed to Paul's intercession. In a mockery, in fact, of the requirement of a miracle, only one being required because John Paul II also abolished the traditional requirement of two for beatification. The postulator of Paul VI's cause, Father Antonio Marazzo, seriously proposes an alleged healing of a child in the womb through Pope Paul's putative intercession. This miracle, which involves a vaguely described serious problem with the fetus, is already suspect because of the limitations of fetal stage diagnoses of medical conditions, which are so often proven wrong when the child is born. Worse, this miracle could not even be confirmed at birth because, and I'm quoting, the family has to wait until the child reaches the age of 15 before confirmation of complete healing can be given, end quote. Now, more than 34 years after Pope Paul's death, this is the postulator's best evidence for the miraculous intercession of Paul VI. Meanwhile, the beatification of Pope Pius XII, an undeniably heroic pope, with numerous attested miracles to his credit, remains stalled at the venerable stage, where it has been since 2009. And Robert Moynihan rightly asks, why is Pope Paul's cause apparently proceeding more quickly than that of Pope Pius, declared venerable in 2009? Well, here's the answer. The council must be canonized so as to obscure the fact of its catastrophic failure. Pius XII has been shunted aside because he was not involved in Vatican II. On the contrary, he decided against convoking an ecumenical council after he convened a commission to consider the possibility. And that decision is one whose prudence has certainly been revealed by subsequent events. In fact, it was the future Pius XII, speaking as Cardinal Pacelli, who uttered this prophecy of revolutionary upheaval in the Church only 31 years before the council began. And this from, appropriately enough, a Fatima perspective. Here's what he said in 1931. I am worried by the Blessed Virgin's message to little Lucia of Fatima. This persistence of Mary about the dangers which menace the Church is a divine warning against the suicide of altering the faith in her liturgy, her theology, and her soul. I hear all around me innovators who wish to dismantle the sacred chapel, destroy the universal flame of the Church, reject her ornaments, and make her feel remorse for her historical past. And then the future Pope Pius XII made this staggering prophecy, which in fact has come true. A day will come when the civilized world will deny its God, when the Church will doubt, as Peter doubted. She will be tempted to believe that man has become God. In our churches, Christians will search in vain for the red lamp where God awaits them. Like Mary Magdalene, weeping before the empty tomb, they will ask, where have they taken him? And how many of us have been in churches where after the Second Vatican Council, the red sanctuary lamp disappeared? That's a pretty staggering fulfillment of a pretty amazing prophecy from a Fatima perspective. Now, no matter how many quick-draw beatifications, even if they beatify every single participant in the Second Vatican Council, except for the traditionalist dissenters, of course, who warned of disasters, even if they do that, they can't alter the reality of what happened during and after what is fairly, if flippantly, called the Second Vatican disaster. On this 50th anniversary of the disaster, it would be a good idea to revisit some keynotes of two of the most troubling documents of this very strange council, Gaudium et Spes and Dignitatis Humanae. In Gaudium, which is supposed to be the very manifesto of the Concilia Aggiornamento, or updating of the Church, the council declared that its aim was, quote, scrutinizing the signs of the times, end quote. Now that's a dubious, and I have to say unprecedented, activity for an ecumenical council, whose province is not assessing facts about a world called modern, but rather safeguarding the faith, morals, and discipline in every age, usually by way of anathemas, which are denunciations of certain errors, declaring that those who hold them are literally accursed because they hold these errors. When the church acts in that area, the charism of infallibility, the gift of infallible teaching, protects the church from promulgating error. But not when you talk about the signs of the times and make speculations about the modern world. Consider, for example, this whopper from Dignitatis Humanae, the most controversial of the Council's documents, and I'm quoting, "A sense of the dignity of the human person has been impressing itself more and more deeply on the consciousness of contemporary man," end quote. No, it hasn't. The crisis of the modern world is precisely that contemporary man has lost sight of his dignity as a being created in the image and likeness of God with an eternal destiny that should be involved in all earthly relations and the laws and institutions of civil society. Everything we do and say in this life should be oriented toward our final state in the next life. But according to Dignitatis Humanae's rosy view of the modern state, and I quote, "The demand is increasingly being made that men should act on their own judgment, enjoying and making use of a responsible freedom, not driven by coercion, but motivated by a sense of duty," end quote. I'm sorry, but that's plainly ridiculous. Contemporary man has no interest whatsoever in responsible freedom, nor any sense of duty to anything higher than his own will or the will of the relevant electoral majority. Now, before the Second Vatican Council, Pope after Pope got the diagnosis right. Here is what Pope Leo XIII said about modern political societies, modern freedoms, in his encyclical Libertas, written in 1888. He's condemned the already prominent idea that, quote, "the efficient cause of the unity of civil society is not to be sought in any principle external to man or superior to him, but simply in the free will of individuals. That the authority in the state comes from the people only, and that just as every man's individual reason is his only rule of life, so the collective reason of the community should be the supreme guide in the management of all public affairs. Hence," said Leo, "the doctrine of the supremacy of the greater number, and that all right and duty reside in the majority." The tyranny of the majority, the collapse of morality as a result. But Dignitatis Humanae somehow overlooked this disastrous worldwide outcome of all the violent revolutions that came out of the so-called Enlightenment and the Enlightenment liberalism and post-Enlightenment liberalism that has become the status quo of the modern nation state. Now, Pope Leo, in line with all of his predecessors and successors before Vatican II and John the 23rd, saw in the modern age, and I'm quoting, "evils by which the human race is oppressed on every side, the widespread subversion of primary truths on which, as on its foundations, human society is based." And he saw, quote, "a deadly kind of plague which infects in its inmost recesses, allowing the human race no respite and foreboding ever fresh disturbances and final disaster," end quote. But Dignitatis Humanae and the Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council, steeped in a kind of optimism that was obviously a delusion, saw this, quoting from the document, "a demand for freedom in human society that chiefly regards the quest for the values proper to the human spirit." And also it saw desires in the minds of men that the Council proposes to declare to be greatly in accord with truth and justice. At the same time the world was falling apart because of the errors that Pope Leo condemned, the Council was praising the state of affairs that resulted from those same errors. And in developing nations, said the Council, in Gaudium et Spes, "peoples, especially those among them who are attached to older traditions, are simultaneously undergoing a movement toward more mature and personal exercise of liberty. No, they aren't. They have been abandoning traditional moral strictures and murdering each other by the millions in democratic revolutions and civil wars that have produced brutal dictatorships ranging from communist to radically Islamist. Concerning the spread of communism, as predicted by Our Lady of Fatima, the Second Vatican Council actually agreed to blind itself to the single most dramatic sign of the times. The Vatican-Moscow Agreement, negotiated at Metz, France before the Council, required the Council to observe a shameful silence concerning communist totalitarianism in order to please two Russian Orthodox observers that John XXIII dearly wished to attend the Council. The French commentator Jean Madiran called this Metz Pact, this silence of the Council, ecclesiastical treason. And he was right. Praising advances in the physical sciences, the Council further offered the opinion that, quote, a more critical ability to distinguish religion from a magical view of the world and from the superstitions which still circulate purifies religion and exacts day by day a more personal and explicit adherence to faith. As a result, many persons are achieving a more vivid sense of God, end quote. No, they aren't. On the contrary, militant atheism is on the rise. Militant scientism has said it has disproved definitively God's existence. And the same false religions the Council is referring to, born of superstition and diabolical influences, have persisted and even flourished everywhere on the planet. And, incredibly enough, these superstitious religions have sent representatives to Assisi at the invitation of the Pope himself to engage in interreligious dialogue and prayers for peace. Now think about this. The Second Vatican Council boasted that the modern world, with the aid of science, had dispelled the superstitions of superstitious religions and that people were achieving a deeper faith. Yet, after the Council, the same religions with these superstitious and magical views of the world, literally everyone from animists to Zoroastrians, the A to Z of superstitious religions, received personal invitations from the Pope to form a motley assembly with Catholics and Protestants at Assisi to pray for peace. At the same time, just as a long line of preconciliar popes had warned, warnings the Council resolutely ignored in its almost ridiculous proclamation of the joys and hopes of contemporary man. Since then, former Christendom has completed its descent into what John Paul II called silent apostasy throughout the Western world not long before his death. And this, he admitted, after decades of hailing the new Pentecost of Vatican II. So which is it? The new Pentecost or silent apostasy? The conviction grows, said the Council in Gaudium et Spes, not only that humanity can and should increasingly consolidate its control over creation, but even more, that it devolves on humanity to establish a political, social, and economic order which will growingly serve man and help individuals as well as groups to affirm and develop the dignity proper to them. I'm sorry, but with all due respect, this is simply rubbish. Rather than following any perceived duty to serve man, to affirm his dignity as an ensouled creature with an eternal destiny, the institutions of the so-called modern world, from the secular state to the so-called free market, have systematically disserved man. They have attacked his supernatural dignity from all sides. Pope after pope after pope recognized this and condemned this state of affairs before the Council. But the Council saw no evil where evil abounded. The human race, said the Council in Gaudium et Spes, has passed from a rather static concept of reality to a more dynamic, evolutionary one, end quote. What in heaven's name is an ecumenical council doing, issuing a statement like that, which sounds like something from a freshman's term paper? There has been no such passage to an evolutionary concept of reality. That's just an illusion imposed upon the public mind by the ideologues of social and political liberalism. There's only one concept of reality. It's the same one that has always existed. And it's the only one that should have been of any importance to the Council. The reality of a fallen world desperately in need of the redeeming grace of Christ in an age that has rejected the influence of grace in the affairs of men. That's not just me speaking. Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was Father Ratzinger, wrote this about the very document of the Council that I just quoted. He said that Gaudium et Spes presents, quote, a colorless doctrine of freedom based upon an unhistorical reading of Scripture, but also an unhistorical and therefore unreal view of man, which cannot therefore stand up to theological or philosophical criticism. And he also said that when the document speaks of human freedom, it falls into downright Pelagian terminology. What does he mean by Pelagian terminology? That's an old heresy, that man can save himself, the heresy of Pelagius, without the aid of divine grace. It's nice to have grace, but God has made man good enough that he can save himself. Doesn't need the graces of the church. The Pelagian heresy came back in a way in Gaudium et Spes, which talks about the modern world and the wonderful progress that man has made in so-called contemporary society. That's why Father Ratzinger, the future pope, called the document downright Pelagian in parts. Cardinal Ratzinger said that the Council attempted to reconcile the Church with a new era inaugurated in 1789. In other words, the French Revolution. But Pius IX condemned in his Syllabus of Errors the very idea, and I'm quoting from the Syllabus of Errors, number 80, the very idea that the Roman pontiff can and ought to reconcile himself and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization, end quote. Why did Pius IX condemn the idea that the Church should reconcile herself and come to terms with the modern world? Because if the Church did that, then the men who make up the Church would become like the men of the modern world. And we would have just what Paul VI admitted took place after Vatican II. An invasion of the Church by worldly thinking. The smoke of Satan entering the Church. The Pope himself admitted that. Case closed. Now, even when the Council acknowledged that men continue to be afflicted by acute hardships and anxieties arising from the ravages of war or the threat of it, I'm quoting, it characterized the state of world affairs as one in which, I can hardly believe this as I read it, the whole human family faces an hour of supreme crisis in its advance toward maturity. What advance toward maturity? The human race has regressed to an infantile state since the time of the Protestant revolt in the 16th century. To say that the human race is maturing is to accept the fundamental principle of the liberals, that man is progressing, that the man of today is superior to the man of yesterday, merely because of the passage of time and his greater enlightenment, apparently through his liberation from the tyranny, so-called, of the Catholic Church. But instead, we've seen a degeneration, a total loss of spiritual maturity, and thus of human maturity, over the past 200 to 300 years. And Catholics know that true human progress depends entirely upon the operation of divine grace. And that grace operates in all times, without regard to particular social conditions. So the men of the 16th century who lived in God's grace are more advanced and more mature than the men of the 21st century who cheat on their wives and practice contraception and abort their children and live like animals. For the Council to speak of the growing maturity of modern man was simply a mockery. Any intelligent layman was as competent as any council father to discern that in 1962, when the Council began, the signs of the times demonstrated not any advance toward human maturity, but rather a terminal regression of the human race, from which only God can save it now. And that is why Pope Benedict said in his Advent address in the year 2010 that moral consensus is collapsing. And, this is the Pope speaking, that the very future of the world is at stake, end quote. And that is why Pius XII said, only 11 years before Vatican II began, quote, the human race is involved today in a supreme crisis which will issue in its salvation by Christ or in its dire destruction, end quote. So, on this 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council, do we celebrate the council, or do we lament the fact that it ever happened? I confess I incline toward the second answer. The council perhaps did not teach any actual heresies, but it ventured into areas where councils clearly have no competence. It gave us a sense of optimism about a modern world that the popes before the council unanimously viewed with the most severe pessimism, warning essentially that this civilization of ours was approaching its end. So on this 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council, it is time to reappraise the Council's legacy with eyes wide open and to recognize that the appellation Second Vatican Disaster may well be justified. For Fatima Perspectives, I'm Chris Ferrara. Thank you for watching.
Our Lady said, if my requests are not heeded, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world, raising up wars and persecutions against the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer, and various nations will be annihilated.